In the spring of 1943, the German frontline tank crews began hearing strange reports from their comrades on the Western Front, rumors of a new American tank arriving in North Africa and Italy. It was said to be fast, light, and numerous, but poorly armored. The Germans, veterans of the Blitzkrieg and masters of armored warfare, didn't worry. They laughed. They called it Tommy Coker, Tommy's Cooker, a dark nickname implying it burst into flames when hit. The British had another word for it, Ronson, after the cigarette lighter brand whose slogan read, "Lights every time." The American Sherman, they believed, was a factory toy, a machine built by engineers who didn't understand the battlefield. In the beginning, they weren't entirely wrong. The early Sherman M4, first deployed in North Africa in late 1942, was no match for the German Tiger or Panther in a one-on-one duel. Its 75mm gun was adequate for infantry support, but useless against the thick frontal armor of the panzer divisions that prowled Tunisia and later Normandy. German commanders regarded it as proof of Allied naivete, a symbol of mass production over craftsmanship. "They fight with quantity, not quality," one German officer wrote in a captured letter. "Their tanks burn bright, but there are always more behind them." At the same time, in Allied briefings, the attitude was pragmatic rather than proud. American and British generals knew exactly what the Sherman was, not a tank to outgun the enemy, but one that could be built, shipped, and repaired faster than any other machine on Earth. It was not a duelist. It was a workhorse, designed to move, to survive, and to multiply. Yet this philosophy, alien to the German doctrine of technological superiority, would eventually prove decisive. The German tankers' mockery came from experience. On the Eastern Front, their Tigers and Panthers dominated Soviet T-34s through superior optics, firepower, and armor. Each Tiger tank could destroy an enemy at 2 kilometers with a single shot. They had grown used to mechanical supremacy, to being the predators of the battlefield. The Sherman, with its high silhouette and gasoline engine, seemed almost a parody of good design. Its armor could be pierced easily by an 88mm gun, and when hit, the stored ammunition often ignited catastrophically. Photos of burning Sherman spread through German propaganda as evidence of Allied inferiority. But beneath that arrogance, a quiet shift was already underway. The German panzers, masterpieces of engineering, were becoming too perfect, too slow to build, too complex to maintain, too expensive to replace. Each Tiger required 300,000 man-hours to construct. Each Sherman, barely a tenth of that. While the German tank factories at Kassel and Nibelungenwerk were bombed repeatedly by the RAF, the Americans were producing hundreds of Shermans a week in Detroit, Lima, and Chicago. What Germany saw as wasteful mass production was, in reality, strategic foresight. German intelligence analysts began to notice. A report from late 1943 by the Wehrmacht's technical division, recently declassified, noted, enemy armor output exceeds ours by a factor of 5. Their losses are quickly replenished, while ours require months. Still, in the field, German crews continued to underestimate the Sherman, mistaking numerical strength for desperation. To them, quality was still king, and the idea that numbers alone could win a war seemed ridiculous. Yet the battlefield was already disproving that logic. In Italy, Allied tank crews were learning. They fought with tactical cunning, using the Sherman's speed and mechanical reliability to outflank German armor. They learned to call in artillery or air support before engaging. And when a Sherman was destroyed, 2 more took its place. In the German field diaries captured later, one recurring line appears, "We kill them, and they return by morning." By 1944, that line had become prophecy. As the Allies prepared to storm Normandy, the Germans still mocked the Sherman as a weak machine. But what they could not see was the vast industrial machine behind it, the American arsenal that was preparing to bury them in steel. When the invasion began, more than 6,000 Shermans were already in service. For every Tiger, there were 10 of them. It was the beginning of the end for German armor superiority, but they didn't know it yet. In those early days, the mockery still echoed through the tank yards and officer mess halls. They still believed that the war would be won by design, not by logistics. What they didn't understand was that the Sherman was not a tank. It was a strategy. And that strategy, cold, industrial, and relentless, was already grinding toward them. The war between tanks was not won on the battlefield. It was won in factories. In 1943, As the German city of Dresden struggled to rebuild its bombed rail lines, 4,000 miles away in Detroit, the night sky glowed with the light of foundries working without pause. Inside the vast halls of Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal tank plant, the air thundered with the rhythm of presses, welders, and diesel engines. Every 8 minutes, a new M4 Sherman rolled off the assembly line. At its peak, the United States was producing tanks faster than Germany could repair them. What the Germans saw as crude industrial excess, the Allies understood as pure strategic power. The American tank industry was a marvel of organization. When the United States entered the war, it possessed neither the doctrine nor the designs for armored warfare. By 1942, it had transformed. Civilian car factories, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, were repurposed overnight into the largest military production system in history. At Ford's giant Willow Run plant, once meant for automobiles, aircraft and engines were assembled side by side with tank components. Thousands of untrained workers, many of them women and immigrants, learned to weld, rivet, and assemble complex armored vehicles with astonishing speed. What Germany achieved with precision, America achieved with repetition. The German factories, by contrast, were paragons of craftsmanship but victims of their own perfectionism. A Tiger tank required nearly 2 years of design refinement and 6 months of construction. Its armor was hand-welded, its optics ground by specialists. Each one was a masterpiece, and a logistical disaster. When the Allies began bombing production centers in Kassel, Magdeburg, and Nuremberg, output fell by half. The Luftwaffe could not protect them, and parts shortages grew catastrophic. The same obsession that made the German tank superior in theory made it impossible to sustain in reality. American production reports from 1944 paint a staggering picture. The U.S. Army received more than 49,000 Sherman tanks before the end of the war. Germany, in total, built fewer than 1,400 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers. While German commanders praised their tanks' invincibility, their own logistics officers called it a machine too beautiful for war. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, later admitted in his post-war testimony that Germany's defeat was industrial as much as tactical. The Americans fought a war of factories, he wrote. Each of their tanks, however inferior, carried with it the weight of 10 behind it. He was right. The Sherman's strength lay not in its armor or its gun, but in its availability. In the industrial cities of America, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, tank production became a national cause. Steel mills operated 24 hours a day. Rubber, copper, and oil were rationed for the war effort. On assembly lines, young women replaced men sent to the front. They learned to build tanks they would never see in action. Each Sherman that rolled out of the arsenal carried a stamped metal plate reading, "Built in the Arsenal of Democracy." To them, it wasn't a slogan. It was a mission. Meanwhile, in Germany, the story was reversed. Fuel shortages crippled movement. Slave labor filled the gaps left by conscripted workers. Factories like Henschel, builder of the Tiger, depended on precision tools and materials that were running out. By 1944, even ball bearings had become a strategic commodity. When Allied bombers destroyed the Schweinfurt bearing plants, every German tank under construction suddenly became a stranded shell. Engineers complained that Hitler demanded miracles while denying them bolts. American engineers took a different approach. They built for function, not elegance. The Sherman's design emphasized standardization, identical engines, tracks, and guns across models. This meant broken tanks could be repaired using parts from others. A field workshop could rebuild a Sherman in 48 hours. A destroyed Tiger often stayed destroyed. The numbers told the story. In the 6 months leading to D-Day, U.S. industry produced more tanks than Germany built during the entire war. German generals noticed. One internal Wehrmacht report from January 1944 warned, "We face an enemy who manufactures faster than we can maneuver." It was an admission that technology alone no longer guaranteed survival. And yet, the Germans clung to the illusion of superiority. Even as Allied tank columns rolled through Italy, German propaganda films showed Tigers demolishing Shermans in staged duels, claiming the Führer's armor remains invincible. But those duels meant nothing when the Shermans never stopped coming. Behind every Allied tank crew was a continent of factories. Behind every German tank, a nation running out of time. By late 1944, German tank crews began to notice the new kind of war they were fighting. Not a battle of machines, but of momentum. For every destroyed Sherman, 2 more appeared on the horizon. The war had become arithmetic, and the Germans were running out of numbers. By 1944, the war in Europe had become a contest of arithmetic, a brutal equation of men, machines, and momentum. The German army still possessed the most feared tanks in the world, the Tiger I, the Panther, the Koenigsegger. Each was a mechanical marvel, capable of destroying a Sherman from over 2 kilometers away. On paper, the Wehrmacht should have held its armored supremacy indefinitely. But on the battlefield, mathematics had turned against them. Every Tiger destroyed or abandoned represented not just the loss of a vehicle, but of a machine that could not be replaced. Every Sherman destroyed was simply replaced by another. In the archives of the U.S. Army Ordnance Department, one report from early 1945 is blunt: quantity has a quality of its own. It wasn't a boast, it was a policy. The Allies had learned that war, especially in its industrial age, was won not by isolated acts of brilliance but by a continuous chain of production and replenishment. The Sherman tank embodied that philosophy. The Americans didn't need to win every duel, only to make sure there were more Shermans rolling forward tomorrow than there were today. On the German side, tank commanders began to notice the shift. After Normandy, German radio intercepts reveal repeated complaints from panzer divisions about unendliche Gegnerkolonnen, endless enemy columns. A Tiger crew might destroy 5 Shermans in an ambush, only to face 15 more an hour later. The psychological toll was immense. One report from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps noted, "For every tank we silence, the enemy sends 3 more. They fight as if their machines are expendable. Ours are irreplaceable." They were right. In 1944, the United States produced over 17,000 Shermans. Germany produced barely 3,000 Panthers and Tigers combined. Allied logistics ensured that those tanks were shipped, unloaded, repaired, and fueled faster than German units could even redeploy. The Allies' control of the seas and skies made the difference between a weapon and a weapon system. The Sherman wasn't the best tank, but it was always there. This principle became doctrine. American commanders like General Omar Bradley and British officers such as Montgomery recognized that victory wasn't about individual engagements. It was about sustaining the offensive. The Sherman's mobility, reliability, and availability allowed armored divisions to remain constantly on the move. Every German tank knocked out meant 1 fewer that could hold a line. Every Sherman lost meant a logistical hiccup, not a catastrophe. To understand the German frustration, one must picture the contrast. In the field, a Tiger tank required a small convoy of support vehicles, fuel trucks, mechanics, and spare parts. When one broke down, which happened often, it could take days to recover. The Sherman, by contrast, was so standardized that parts were interchangeable across models. In a single day, a repair team could salvage damaged Shermans, cannibalize parts, and send half of them back to battle. American tank recovery units became as crucial as the tanks themselves. War was no longer about who hit harder, but who got up faster. As the Allies pushed through France, that numbers game became visible even to ordinary soldiers. Infantrymen recalled seeing Shermans advancing in columns stretching to the horizon. German defenders described the same sight with disbelief. "The tanks never stop," wrote a German corporal during the Falaise pocket. "They move like ants, endless, tireless, impossible to kill all." The Sherman's numerical advantage also had a tactical impact. Commanders could risk maneuvers that would have been unthinkable with rarer machines. Flanking, probing, and sacrificing tanks for position became viable strategies because replacements were always on the way. The Germans, by contrast, were forced into conservation. Each Tiger was precious, each Panther irreplaceable. The result was a creeping paralysis, a fear of loss that kept many powerful tanks out of decisive battles simply because they couldn't afford to lose them. Even Albert Speer, in his private notes, recognized this imbalance. "We produced art," he wrote, "and they produced war." The American industrial system treated tanks as consumables, not icons. This mindset was alien to the German philosophy of perfection. To the Americans, a tank was a tool, and tools could be replaced. To the Germans, a tank was an expression of genius. And genius doesn't scale. By late 1944, German tank battalions were operating at 40% strength, with mechanical failures outnumbering combat losses. Allied armored divisions, by contrast, were at 110%, receiving new tanks faster than they could wear them out. The battlefield statistics tell the story. In Normandy, for every German tank destroyed, the Allies lost 5. Yet within weeks, the Germans were retreating. The reason? The Allies had already built 15 more. In the end, the Sherman didn't win by being invincible. It won by being inevitable. The Germans mocked its simplicity, its reliability, its ubiquity, until the skies filled with aircraft guiding columns of Shermans across Europe like a steel tide. The Tiger was a masterpiece. The Sherman was a factory product. But factories, unlike masterpieces, can multiply. By the time the Reich realized this, the numbers could no longer be undone. The tank war was over. The production war had just begun. By the summer of 1944, the Sherman had proven it could win the war of numbers, but not necessarily the war of survival. On the ground, tank crews faced a brutal truth: every encounter with a Tiger or Panther was a gamble. German guns could penetrate a Sherman from 1,500 meters. The Sherman's 75mm gun could rarely do the same unless it struck from the flank or rear. Inside the armored hulls, American and British crews learned to live with the knowledge that their tank could become a coffin in seconds. Yet what followed was one of the most remarkable demonstrations of adaptation in modern warfare. The men who drove and fought in Shermans refused to die by design. They turned ingenuity into armor. Officially, the M4 Sherman was a medium tank, fast, mobile, and reliable. Unofficially, it was a canvas for field improvisation. Soldiers began modifying their machines with whatever they could find. In Normandy and Italy, units started welding spare track links onto the hull and turret for extra protection. Others filled sandbags or concrete along the sides, believing it might absorb a panzer shell. Mechanics called it field dressing. Commanders called it desperation. But for crews under fire, it was life insurance. A declassified British Army report from August 1944 noted, crews frequently apply unapproved armor enhancements using materials from wrecks and local resources. Though often crude, these modifications have measurable psychological benefit. In other words, it helped them feel like they had a fighting chance. Some crews went further. In Italy, Sherman units began strapping logs or steel plating along their sides to detonate Panzerfaust prematurely. In France, crews removed side skirts and welded chicken wire to deflect shaped charges. One tank in the 3rd Armored Division, nicknamed Concrete Charlie, carried a literal wall of hardened cement on its front hull. It slowed the tank, but the crew swore by it. Even the Germans noticed. A captured report from a Panzer battalion near Caen observed, enemy tanks are frequently equipped with irregular additional plating or track links. This complicates range estimation and may deflect glancing shots. In short, improvisation was working. Yet protection wasn't only about armor. It was about tactics. By mid-1944, Allied crews began to understand that survival came from teamwork, not individual duels. Sherman platoons learned to move in coordinated packs, 3 or 4 tanks covering each other's advance. While a Tiger might destroy the lead tank, the others could maneuver for a side shot. It was the same principle that Allied air forces used against superior German aircraft, swarm tactics against solitary predators. In a report from the U.S. 2nd Armored Division, an officer wrote, "We stopped fighting German tanks one-on-one. We fight them as a team, 3 guns against 1 monster." That doctrine, simple but effective, began to change the balance. The Sherman couldn't win through brute force, but it could win through coordination. The British contribution to this evolution was the Firefly, a Sherman refitted with the powerful 17-pounder gun. Though technically introduced as a stopgap measure, it became a legend. The Firefly could destroy a Tiger at 1,500 meters, something no other Allied tank in 1944 could claim. To protect their advantage, commanders often disguised Fireflies by painting their longer gun barrels to resemble standard Shermans. From a distance, they looked harmless, until they fired. Even standard Shermans benefited from constant mechanical upgrades. The transition to the 76mm gun, better ammunition, and wet stowage for shells, which drastically reduced fires, increased survivability. The much-mocked Ronson nickname began to fade. Engineers listened to crew reports, implemented field fixes, and sent improved variants to the front within months. The Germans, still obsessing over perfection, could take years to modify a design. The Americans evolved by iteration. Inside the tank, the mindset of crews changed too. They became pragmatic, fatalistic, and fiercely loyal to their machines. A typical crew treated its Sherman like a living being. Naming it, customizing it, repainting it after every battle. In letters home, soldiers described their tanks not as tools, but as partners. "She's ugly, loud, and smells like oil," wrote one gunner from the 4th Armored Division, "but she keeps me alive." In contrast, German tank crews often viewed their machines as extensions of national pride, invincible until they broke down or burned. The Sherman crews had no such illusions. They knew they were vulnerable. That honesty gave them flexibility. As the campaign in Normandy dragged into the bocage, a nightmare of hedgerows and ambushes, Sherman units adapted again. Engineers welded cutting blades to the front of tanks, turning them into rhinos capable of bursting through dense terrain. What was once a liability, the tank size, became an advantage. Now, Shermans could charge through cover, flank German positions, and attack from unexpected directions. Every modification, every trick, every field innovation reflected a simple truth: the Sherman was never the best tank, but it was the most adaptable. It evolved in real time, molded by the hands of those who fought in it. By the end of 1944, photographs showed rows of Shermans that no longer looked identical. Some were caked in mud and armor fragments. Others were bristling with welded metal and sandbags. They looked crude, but they were surviving. The Germans still mocked their appearance. They called them farm tanks. But those farm tanks were the ones rolling over German defenses, one village at a time. For every Tiger that stood majestic, there were 10 Shermans pushing forward. Each one bearing scars, improvisations, and the will of its crew. The Tiger represented perfection. The Sherman represented persistence. And in war, persistence always lasts longer. By the winter of 1943, Allied tank commanders knew that courage alone could not outgun a Tiger. Every engagement was a reminder of German superiority in armor and firepower. British and American crews reported seeing their shells ricochet off Panther glassy plates like stones thrown at a wall. The need for a tank that could kill a Tiger before being killed was no longer strategic, it was existential. And it was the British who found the answer, not through an entirely new machine, but by turning the much-mocked Sherman into something altogether different. They called it the Sherman Firefly. The story began in secret workshops scattered across Britain in 1943. Engineers at the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Wideridge and Major George Bridie, believed they could fit Britain's powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun, the same weapon that could pierce a Tiger's frontal armor, into the Sherman's turret. Official channels dismissed the idea as impractical. The gun was too large, the recoil too violent, the turret ring too small. But the British were desperate, and desperation breeds innovation. Bridie, a man more stubborn than cautious, cut through regulations and began modifying the tank himself. He rotated the gun breech sideways, rebalanced the recoil system, and removed part of the radio compartment to make it fit. Ammunition was stored in modified racks along the hull, and the breech operated at the very limits of the Sherman structure. It was awkward, unorthodox, and it worked. By early 1944, the first prototypes were being tested in live fire. The results were astonishing. The Firefly's gun could penetrate a Tiger's armor at 1,500 meters, the same distance at which German tanks had always held the advantage. British High Command took notice. Despite American skepticism, many U.S. officers considered the modification unsafe. Production was approved under urgent directive. The conversion required no new factory, it could be done using existing Shermans. In a matter of months, British workshops had turned hundreds of ordinary tanks into lethal Tiger killers. The first Fireflies reached frontline units in time for D-Day. They were assigned sparingly, often one Firefly per troop of 4 Shermans. The reasoning was simple. A single Firefly could kill a Tiger, while its 3 standard companions provided covering fire and mobility. The Firefly became the silent spearhead of Allied armored formations, easily mistaken for a regular Sherman by German spotters. Crews even painted false muzzle brakes on the long barrel to disguise it. The first encounters shocked the Germans. During the Battle of Normandy, Fireflies proved their worth again and again. On July 8, 1944, near Villers-Bocage, a Firefly commanded by Sergeant Joe Ekins of the Northamptonshire Yeomanry achieved one of the most famous kills of the war, destroying 3 Tigers, including the tank of German ace Michael Wittmann, within a few minutes. Reports of the engagement spread quickly. The Tiger, long a symbol of German invincibility, had been destroyed by what the Germans had once mocked as a furnace on tracks. Panzer crews began to adapt their tactics in fear. Intelligence intercepts from late 1944 revealed German orders warning tank commanders, beware of Shermans with long guns. Engage only under favorable conditions. That long gun was the 17-pounder, and it had become a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. British tankers, once forced to fight at suicidal ranges, now hunted Tigers with confidence. The Firefly's gun had a velocity of nearly 3,000 feet per second. It could pierce 150 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards. In contrast, the Tiger's famous 88 millimeters gun could destroy a Sherman easily, but only if it struck first. Now, for the first time, the Allies could strike first too. Even the Americans, initially skeptical, began to take notice. Some U.S. units adopted Fireflies for mixed operations, while American engineers rushed to upgrade their own Sherman with a 76 millimeters high-velocity gun. But none matched the raw power of the British 17-pounder. For once, the Allies didn't need to rely on air strikes or numerical advantage. They had a tank that could win a duel. Yet the Firefly's success came with costs. Its gun was massive, its recoil jarring, and its ammunition storage limited. The cramped turret made reloading a struggle. Crews endured deafening blasts and thick cordite fumes after each shot. But they didn't care. They finally had the weapon they needed. Captured German reports after the war confirmed what the Firefly had accomplished. The British Sherman with long barrel is dangerous, one Panzer commander wrote. Its penetration power is remarkable. It should be destroyed first. That last sentence was, in a sense, the ultimate compliment. By late 1944, over 2,000 Fireflies were in service. They had changed the balance of fear. The Sherman was no longer just a symbol of quantity, it had teeth. For the Germans, it was the beginning of doubt. For the Allies, it was proof that adaptability could overcome even the most intimidating enemy. The Firefly was born from necessity, forged in defiance, and perfected in combat. It didn't erase the Sherman's flaws, it transcended them. The tank that once burned easily now burned brighter, as the weapon that finally turned the hunter into the hunted. By the summer of 1944, the fields of Normandy had become the graveyard of German armor. What began as a contest of design had devolved into a test of endurance, and no army was built for endurance like the Allies. The Germans still believed in the supremacy of their Tigers and Panthers. But the war in Normandy proved a harsher truth: even the most formidable tank is worthless when surrounded, starved, and outnumbered 10-1. The Allies called it attrition warfare. The Germans called it Vernichtungskrieg, the war of annihilation. In Normandy, both found their meaning. The Allied landings had brought more than men to France. They brought logistics, the one weapon Germany never truly possessed. Within days of D-Day, the beaches at Omaha, Gold, and Juno were pouring out a mechanical flood. Crates of ammunition, convoys of fuel, columns of replacement tanks. The machine of war was awake. By late June, over 1,500 Shermans had landed in France. By mid-July, that number had doubled. Every night, more arrived. Every day, more advanced. The Germans watched with disbelief. For every Panther that rolled out from the hedgerows, a dozen Shermans followed behind it. Even when Allied tanks were destroyed, recovery teams salvaged them, repaired them, and sent them back within days. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, left its dead machines on the roadside. There was no fuel, no parts, no time. Each German tank loss was permanent. The first great test of this imbalance came in the hedgerow country, the bocage, where thick earth banks and narrow lanes turned tank warfare into close combat. The Panthers ruled the open fields, but in the bocage, their long barrels became a liability. Shermans, lighter and more agile, maneuvered between hedges like hunters. American engineers equipped tanks with steel rhino tusks, welded prongs designed to slice through the hedgerows and burst into ambush positions. The idea came from a sergeant with a blowtorch and a sense of survival. Within weeks, entire battalions had them. Improvisation had become doctrine. Still, the fighting was brutal. German anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts turned every hedgerow into a death trap. Sherman crews adapted. They advanced under smoke screens, coordinating with artillery and infantry. They used mass, not perfection. A single Tiger might destroy 4 Shermans before falling, but when it fell, it was irreplaceable. The Allies could afford the exchange. The Germans could not. By July, the Wehrmacht's armored divisions were bleeding out. Reports from Panzergruppe West estimated tank losses at over 2,000 within a month. Some units were operating with fewer than 10 serviceable vehicles. In contrast, the Americans replaced entire battalions overnight. The battlefield began to tilt, not by brilliance, but by pressure. Then came Operation Cobra. The American breakout from Normandy. In late July 1944, the skies over St. Lo opened in thunder. Allied bombers, guided by radio and radar, turned the German front into dust. When the smoke cleared, the Shermans moved in, hundreds of them, side by side, engines roaring across the shattered countryside. German armor, unable to maneuver under constant air attack, disintegrated. Within days, the Allies achieved what German generals had considered impossible: they broke through. The result was catastrophe for the Reich, the Falaise pocket. In August 1944, nearly 50,000 German troops and hundreds of vehicles were trapped in a narrow corridor near Falaise, surrounded by converging American, British, and Canadian forces. The Sherman became the executioner. From the ridges and fields, Allied tanks and artillery fired relentlessly into the trapped convoys. A German officer later described it as a slaughterhouse of steel. When the fighting ended, the roads were choked with burned-out panzers, their crews dead or captured. A few Tigers managed to escape, but the panzer divisions as a fighting force had ceased to exist. Captured reports from German high command reveal the shock. "Our armored corps has collapsed under overwhelming material pressure," one general wrote. Enemy tanks seem without limit. Even when destroyed, they return within days. It was the first formal acknowledgement that Germany could no longer win a mechanized war. And yet, even as defeat loomed, the myth of German superiority persisted. Propaganda continued to boast of Tigers dominating the battlefield. But the numbers told the truth. By September 1944, the Allies had landed over 12,000 tanks in France. Germany, crippled by fuel shortages and bombing raids, could barely field a few hundred. The Sherman's strength was not invulnerability, it was inevitability. The Germans called it die Eisenlawine, the iron avalanche. They could destroy it, delay it, burn it, but they could not stop it. The tank they had once mocked now defined the rhythm of the war. When American soldiers advanced past the twisted carcasses of Panthers and Tigers, they often found them abandoned, out of fuel, their crews long gone. The Allies had learned the simplest, oldest lesson of war: the side that keeps moving wins. The Sherman was never supposed to be a hero. It was supposed to be practical. But in the mud of Normandy and the inferno of Falaise, practicality became power. By the end of August 1944, France was free, and the panzer divisions were ghosts. The Germans had laughed at the Sherman once. They weren't laughing now. When historians describe how the Allies defeated Nazi Germany, they often point to D-Day, to air superiority, or to the relentless courage of soldiers on the ground. But buried beneath all those victories was a quieter, colder truth: the Allies didn't just outfight the Germans. They outsupplied them. The Sherman tank was the proof of that invisible war. It wasn't merely built to fight. It was built to be maintained, replaced, and fueled faster than anything the Axis could imagine. Its real weapon wasn't its gun. It was the system behind it. In the German army, a tank was a work of art. It was handcrafted, tuned, and temperamental. When a Tiger broke down, it needed a specialist. When a Sherman broke down, it needed a wrench. That difference defined the war after Normandy. By late 1944, the Allied advance through France was sustained by an enormous, unprecedented logistical network, one of the greatest achievements in military history. The backbone of that system was the Red Ball Express, a fleet of over 6,000 trucks running day and night from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines, carrying everything from rations to tank parts. Nearly 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers, operating under constant strain and danger. They drove on makeshift roads, often under enemy air attack, to deliver the lifeblood of the army: fuel and ammunition. Every gallon of gasoline they delivered kept the Shermans moving. And movement was victory. The U.S. Army Ordnance Department's post-war analysis described it plainly: the Sherman tank was not the most powerful vehicle of the war, but it was the most available. The key word wasn't strength, it was availability. At any moment, somewhere in France or Belgium, replacement engines, transmissions, or tracks were being unloaded, ready to patch another Sherman back into service. By contrast, German tanks died in isolation. The Allies had destroyed the Reich's rail network, fuel depots, and repair facilities. The few tanks that reached the front often ran dry or broke down before they could engage. In the chaos after Falaise, entire panzer divisions were stranded because their vehicles simply couldn't move. The Luftwaffe could no longer protect supply lines. German logistics had collapsed into fragments. Meanwhile, American logistics had become a science. Field depots like the Seine section in northern France could rebuild damaged Shermans from parts in days. Some were even salvaged from battlefields, hauled back by massive M26 tank transporters, repaired overnight, and returned to the front with fresh crews. Crews joked that Shermans never die, they just change drivers. It wasn't far from the truth. Every component of the Sherman was standardized. The same engine that powered a tank in Italy fit perfectly into one in Belgium. Tracks, guns, and transmissions were interchangeable across models. A broken Sherman in the mud wasn't a disaster, it was a puzzle waiting to be reassembled. The Germans, trapped in a perfectionist design philosophy, could never achieve that. Each Tiger required custom parts. Each Panther was unique in its own way. That uniqueness was fatal. A declassified German technical memo from late 1944 lamented, "Our machines demand constant attention. The Americans build machines that ignore attention." It was a bitter truth. One their engineers couldn't fix under Allied bombing. But it wasn't just parts that kept the Shermans alive. It was the invisible network of men who served them. Behind every tank on the battlefield stood mechanics, welders, and quartermasters, an army behind the army. Field workshops operated like miniature factories, welding new armor, improvising spare parts, even repainting tanks within hours. American doctrine treated maintenance as combat support, not an afterthought. When tanks stopped moving, mechanics advanced with them. Fuel was the other god of war. The Sherman's gasoline engine made it vulnerable to fire, but it also gave it range and reliability. It could run on standard fuel, easy to produce and transport. German tanks, by contrast, required high-octane synthetic fuel, increasingly scarce as the Reich's oil fields in Romania fell under Allied control. By late 1944, Panthers were being abandoned not from battle damage, but from empty tanks. Some were even blown up by their own crews to prevent capture. The Allies didn't have to destroy every Tiger, starvation did the job for them. In September 1944, as Allied forces approached the German border, logistics briefly faltered. The front was advancing faster than supply could follow. Tank units ran dry, not from enemy fire, but from success. Yet within weeks, new pipelines, depots, and rail lines solved the crisis. The same efficiency that had produced the Sherman was now feeding it. The Germans could not comprehend it. One Wehrmacht colonel, captured near Aachen, told interrogators, "Your tanks never seem to rest. We destroy them, but they reappear the next day. We fight ghosts made of steel." Those ghosts were the result of logistics, of an industrial ecosystem so vast and self-sustaining that no amount of tactical genius could overcome it. In the end, the Sherman was not a miracle of engineering. It was a miracle of organization. It proved that modern war belonged not to those who built the best machines, but to those who could keep them running longest. Germany built tanks for glory. America built tanks for Tuesday. And Tuesday always came. By late 1944, the German army was no longer fighting a single enemy. It was fighting an entire ecosystem of destruction. Above every battlefield, the sky itself had turned hostile. The Allies had achieved something the Wehrmacht never imagined possible: absolute air supremacy. To the soldiers on the ground, it meant one thing: every German tank was a target, and every Sherman was an ally to the sky. The war of armor had merged with the war of the air. The transformation began in the summer skies over Normandy. While the Sherman fought through hedgerows and towns, high above, waves of P-47 Thunderbolts, Hawker Typhoons, and P-38 Lightnings scoured the roads, hunting anything that moved. The Germans learned quickly, to move by daylight was to die. Allied pilots called it tank plinking. It was systematic, merciless, and precise. Fighter bombers armed with rockets and .50 caliber guns strafed convoys, destroyed fuel trucks, and obliterated columns before they ever reached the front. The Tiger and Panther, the pride of Hitler's Panzerwaffe, were now helpless beneath the roar of radial engines. In August 1944, during the Falaise Pocket, the coordination between Allied armor and air power reached a terrifying efficiency. U.S. and British tank columns advanced in communication with air controllers, who directed squadrons overhead by radio. When resistance stiffened, a call went out, and within minutes, the sky erupted. P-47s dove through clouds of smoke, unleashing rockets into woods and villages where German armor hid. The results were devastating. German reports described flaming graveyards of tanks caught in the open. One Tiger commander wrote bitterly, "Our tanks are useless when the sky belongs to the enemy." The Sherman thrived in this new warfare. Unlike the heavy German tanks, which relied on surprise and open ground, the Sherman operated as part of a system. It advanced with infantry on the ground and aircraft overhead. A trinity of force the Germans could no longer match. The Allies didn't need every Sherman to win every duel. They needed them to hold ground long enough for air power to finish the job. And the air power always came. The P-47 Thunderbolt became the Sherman's guardian angel. Built like a flying tank itself, it could dive at nearly 400 miles per hour, fire 8.50 caliber guns, and launch rockets capable of piercing even Tiger armor. Pilots nicknamed it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, an appropriate name for a plane that carried 2,500 pounds of destruction. In one after-action report from August 1944, the 9th Air Force claimed over 2,500 German armored vehicles destroyed in just 2 weeks. The exact number was likely lower, but the psychological impact was total. German tank crews began to fear the sound of aircraft engines more than enemy guns. The Hawker Typhoon, flown by the RAF, was equally feared. Its 60-pound RP-3 rockets could obliterate even the heaviest German tanks with a single hit. German soldiers dubbed it the Whistling Death for the sound its rockets made in descent. By late 1944, panzer divisions could only move under cover of darkness, crawling along forest roads in silence, terrified of the dawn. This alliance between steel and sky changed everything for the Sherman. Where once it was the underdog, it became part of an unstoppable machine. Even if outgunned in a direct fight, the Sherman could fix the enemy's position, mark it with smoke, and call in air support. The result was annihilation from above. Captured German documents from the Ardennes offensive reveal the frustration this caused. One report from a Panzer Grenadier regiment read, "The enemy's tanks call upon aircraft as if summoning artillery. Within minutes, the air fills with fire. Movement is impossible. Our armor cannot breathe." The Wehrmacht's tactical brilliance was now trapped beneath Allied coordination. The synergy extended beyond combat. Allied engineers equipped tank units with radio links to air squadrons, ensuring near-instant response times. In essence, every Sherman became an extension of the Allied Air Command. No German tank could ever match that network. And when the skies cleared over the Rhine, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Germans could build tanks that defied bullets, but they could not build tanks that defied gravity. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe existed only in name. Its pilots, outnumbered and outtrained, were shot down before they reached their targets. The skies belonged to the Allies, and the Shermans moved beneath them like a rolling tide, unstoppable and unchallenged. American airmen called it the perfect storm. The Sherman didn't win alone, it won because it belonged to something larger, an industrial organism that fought in every dimension. The factories built the tanks, the trucks delivered them, and the planes guarded them. It was the full expression of Allied warfare, efficiency, coordination, and relentlessness. In the final months of the war, as the Shermans crossed into Germany, the sky thundered above them, not with bombs anymore, but with assurance. For the first time in history, an army advanced knowing that the heavens themselves were on its side. The Germans once believed their tanks were the gods of the battlefield. By 1945, those gods were looking up, and finding none that answered. By the winter of 1944, the Sherman's long, grinding journey had carried it from the beaches of Normandy through the ruins of France and into the very heart of Europe. What began as a desperate contest of armor had become a methodical conquest of terrain. The German army, once the master of blitzkrieg, now faced its own tactics turned against it. The Allies had become the storm, and the Sherman was its steel spearhead. The road to the Rhine was paved not with strategy, but with persistence. As the Allied advance surged eastward, the logistical miracle behind it continued to function like clockwork. Thousands of Shermans rolled through France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, their engines humming with mechanical defiance. Each one carried crews hardened by months of battle, men who had watched friends burn inside their tanks, yet still climbed back in every morning. They were no longer the naive soldiers who had landed at Omaha or Gold. They were professionals of survival, veterans of attrition, moving with cold, mechanical determination. The German defense, however, was far from broken. In December 1944, Hitler gambled everything on one final offensive, the Ardennes counterattack, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. Under the cover of fog and snow, over 1,000 German tanks, including Panthers, Tigers, and the new King Tigers, slammed into the thin American lines in Belgium. The weather grounded Allied aircraft, and for the first time since Normandy, the Sherman faced the enemy alone. What followed was chaos. In the forests around Bastogne and Saint-Vith, Sherman crews fought blind, surrounded, outgunned, and cut off. Reports from the 10th Armored Division describe point-blank duels between Shermans and Panthers at distances under 200 meters. One American tanker recalled, "We could hear the Tigers before we saw them, the earth shook like thunder." The Germans regained, briefly, the tactical advantage. Their heavy tanks smashed through snow-covered roads, their guns slicing through Sherman armor with ease. But once again, the outcome would be decided not by engineering, but by endurance. The Allies could afford to lose tanks, the Germans could not afford to lose time. Within a week, fuel shortages began crippling the German advance. King Tigers, enormous and terrifying, were abandoned in the snow, their crews siphoning gasoline just to escape. Allied logistics, though stretched, never failed completely. Reinforcements poured in, bringing fresh Shermans to the front. And when the skies cleared, the P-47s and Typhoons returned, turning retreat into slaughter. By January 1945, the Bulge had collapsed. The Sherman, battered but unbroken, had held the line. From that point onward, nothing could stop the Allies. The Ardennes had been Hitler's last throw of the dice, and it had cost him his final reserves of tanks, fuel, and faith. The Allied armies crossed into Germany with a momentum that was less like invasion and more like inevitability. The Rhine River, the last great barrier of the Reich, was reached by March. At Remagen, American troops found the Ludendorff Bridge miraculously intact. Within hours, Shermans were rumbling across it, their tracks clanking over German soil. The Wehrmacht attempted to destroy the bridge, but it was too late. The flood had begun. Everywhere the Shermans went, they found the ruins of the Panzer divisions. Burned-out hulks of Tigers lay in ditches, their engines torn apart by lack of maintenance, their turrets blown open by rockets or artillery. The myth of German invincibility had ended not with a great duel, but with mechanical exhaustion. Captured documents from early 1945 show the despair in German ranks. One Wehrmacht report from the Cologne sector reads, "We have no fuel, no replacements, and no air cover. The enemy attacks day and night. Their tanks are countless." In that same month, American tankers entered Cologne, where one of the most iconic tank duels of the war occurred. A lone Panther hidden in the city square destroyed several Shermans before being taken out by a single well-placed shot. The incident was filmed by a U.S. Army cameraman. The footage remains one of the last real tank duels of the European war. Beyond Cologne, resistance crumbled. The Rhine crossings turned into a rolling offensive that swept across Germany with industrial precision. Each day, hundreds of Shermans advanced, flanked by infantry and followed by supply trucks. The German people, long shielded by propaganda, now saw the full scale of Allied power. The invincible Panzerwaffe was gone. The factories that once built Tigers were rubble. The war had come home, and it came on Sherman tracks. By April 1945, the Allies had reached the Elbe River. The Soviets were approaching Berlin from the east. In the ruins of their cities, German soldiers abandoned their tanks and surrendered. Many destroyed their own machines before doing so, preferring to burn them rather than see them captured. One U.S. intelligence officer wrote in his report, "The German tank force no longer exists as an organized unit. Its remnants are scattered machines, without fuel, without hope." The Sherman had done what no one believed it could. It had gone from being the most mocked tank of the war to the one that ended it. The road to the Rhine was paved with its tracks, and behind every one of those tracks was a story of sacrifice, industry, and relentless motion. When the guns fell silent in May 1945, the Sherman tank stood across Europe like a monument to endurance. From Normandy's beaches to Germany's heartland, it had been the tireless engine of Allied victory, not the sharpest sword, but the one that never broke. Over 50,000 were built, and thousands more continued to serve in foreign armies long after the war ended. The Germans had built masterpieces. The Americans had built history. In captured factories, German engineers examined Shermans with quiet disbelief. They saw no genius, only simplicity. And yet, it was that simplicity that had conquered them. The Sherman represented the industrial age at its purest, efficient, adaptable, unrelenting. It didn't win because it was perfect. It won because it worked. In the years that followed, its steel tracks became the foundation of a new world order. The age of production warfare, where logistics would matter more than legends. The Tiger was remembered in fear. The Sherman was remembered in victory. And as the smoke cleared over Europe, one truth remained carved into the ruins of the Reich. Wars are not won by the mightiest weapon, but by the weapon that never stops coming.